this universe is about to get super weird and you're completely not ready for it. I think we're ready. Are you ready? Let's go. It's a particularly perilous time for creative people. So we have this promise from the technologists and the capitalists, and forgive me for using the term, but the boomers, that if we work hard and if we build our skills, our creativeness is valuable enough, then we'll be rewarded for it. But we also live in a time where everything is derivative, but there's a constant demand for novelty. There's a constant demand for something new. And that demand for novelty, some would have you believe, comes from people my age, elder millennials. But I think we can point that finger somewhere else. I think that if we look deep into our hearts and understand what millennials really want, what they really want is the promise of stability, and they want to avoid having the rug at the end of the Anthropocene pulled out from under their feet. But that doesn't make millennials any less creative. And that doesn't make their drive for creativity any less powerful than any of the generations that came before us. We're just stuck with the burden of fighting the onset of AGI and a true possibility of infinite novelty, with finding something, some way of explaining our experience and explaining our place in time without being fully derivative. It's a nearly impossible challenge. How to Live Safely in a Science-Fictional Universe is a story about a father who is afraid of fatherhood and is essentially absent, and a son who pines for his presence. It's an old story, a father gone rogue, and a son who grew up and experienced life essentially without him and is now grappling to understand what his life means. The book itself throws in the added existence of a temporal paradox in which both of them essentially have infinity to continue missing the opportunities that they once had. This is going to sound a lot harsher than it's intended to sound, but in a lot of ways, this book is a millennial's attempt to write a Kurt Vonnegut novel. And instead of having the depth of tragedy of war to suss out meaning in a temporally dislocated narrative, as a millennial, he has something much more simple. He has the failings of a father that was the son of the greatest generation. Instead of the horrors of war, you have the distraction of a parent. And instead of discovering our humanity, what we have here is an exploration in what capitalism has wrought on our parents and their outlook of the universe and the things that they find important to them. Familial strife and absence and loss and longing. These are all things that are common to each of us. There's nothing more or less special about it in a millennial. But millennials, and I have to respond to this because the accusations are so clear. Millennials are blamed for ruining everything. We're blamed for wanting too much change too fast. And we're blamed for not wanting to change at all. We're blamed for tearing down entrenched systems while also having no power to do that. We're told you have value if you can find your place in the market. But if you can't find your place in the market, you have no value. And these are all objectivist philosophies that the boomers exhibit with such clarity and with such intensity that it's almost as worth addressing as war. And of course, that's what we have here. We have a millennial who is trying to find his place in the canon of 20th and 21st century literature to write something that isn't fully derivative, that is marketable, and that is simple, but told in a way that is unique in an attempt to appeal to a generation and to a marketplace that demands novelty at all costs. You're probably at least somewhat familiar with Terence McKenna. I'm sure the YouTube algorithm will gladly oblige and show you hours of his lectures. But one of the things that McKenna talked a lot about was this idea of novelty. Novelty just being new shit. And that new shit can be construction. That new shit can be destruction. It can be confusion. It can be social change. It can be climate change. But when new shit happens, shit gets weird. Whether it's the fall of Rome or the end of the Younger Dryas, novelty is novel. If we focus only on storytelling, then we have to admit to ourselves that the stories that we're trying to tell have been told over and over and over again. So we have no choice but to be derivative. What we do have choice in is how to tell that story. And if we can find a way to tell it in a way that isn't derivative, then maybe we can share a deeper message. We are linear creatures. We exist in a linear way, but we don't necessarily think in a linear way. We all choose to create a narrative, and the narrative is constantly evolving as we move in a linear way through time. But our minds look back, and they look back at all of the things that led up and that composed the narrative that we define ourselves with. As a creative writing student, if I had incorporated, quote, sciencey things into a story in order to make what was otherwise a banal story seem a bit less derivative, a bit more creative, and maybe hit a little bit more, well, like most things, I would have probably been beaten to death by my instructor. You see, writing schools don't teach you how to be marketable. They teach you how to write. And they teach you how to write in a very particular way. And a lot of it's really good, but ultimately, it's the market that tells us whether or not it's valuable. So what's the goal? What's the goal in creativity? Is it to find a deeper truth? Is it to point at the creation around us and make it make sense? Or are we just trying to find something lucrative? It's honestly a really hard book to talk about because on one hand, it does have that flavor of something that a person working through their shit in their 20s sits down to write in order to exercise all of their daddy feels. But there's not anything really wrong with that. it is what it is. And I could criticize it and say, this isn't really science fiction, which is probably an apt criticism. I'm not really sure that you can find this in the science fiction section of any bookstore. Like I said, it's Yu's attempt to write a Vonnegut novel. And as a millennial who loves Vonnegut and honestly sees him as one of the cornerstones of 20th century American literature, why wouldn't you want to try to write a Vonnegut novel? Does that mean that even stylistically, this can't escape the label of derivative? It certainly has a lot of the things that we like in science fiction. There's a quirky, depressed AI. We've seen that in Hitchhiker's Guide, of course. There's a grand temporal paradox that would probably anger anybody that has any deep advocation for the sciences. This is a literary mind, not necessarily a science mind that wrote this. So it's definitely not hard science fiction. No, it fits directly into that literary nook, that 21st century literary nook, where we are all compounded by this extreme and intense explosion in technology and technological novelty. But our mindsets are still derivative of a simpler people, of a simpler way of life. And we're just not adapted for it. And I think that's what this novel really puts its finger on very well. Beyond the daddy issues, beyond the subtle millennial yearning, it's putting a finger on something human inside of us and says, hang on, this universe is about to get super weird and you're completely not ready for it. And markets are hungry for novelty, whether they're literary markets or music markets or food. People crave new things because there's a deep void in all of us. And if I'm going to argue this point, I would say that it's deepest in the boomers. There's an emptiness inside that was left behind by something. Maybe it was a promise. Maybe it was the realization that the promises were a lie. Or maybe it was just decades and decades of convincing yourself that you weren't worth anything if you weren't marketable. Either way, we all crave to fill this space, and we tend to want to fill it with something novel, something new. And we're at a point now where we're facing the exponential growth of artificial intelligence and neural networks and the things that those two things can produce. And we're trying to figure out what to do with all this new shit. If you look at Midjourney, if you look at ChatGPT, we're at a place of nearly infinite novelty. And yet, all of that novelty is derivative. It's derivative of all the things that we've created and pumped into the internet, much of it completely unmarketable. It's impossible for me to know whether or not anything that I've created, either physically or on paper, any of my creative journeys will ever be marketable. I don't know. I'm going to wager Probably not very much. But I don't let that define my value. And I reject the notion that marketability is where the value in creativity comes into play. Even though we're at the end of the Anthropocene, or the apparent end of the Anthropocene, my hope is that my children get to live on. My hope is that they can live on into deep old age. And when my bones are dust, they'll have a handful of things to remember me by. They'll have the memories of me and my presence. They'll have the memories of my drive and my focus to create. And they'll even have some of those creations, probably. Pieces of furniture that I've built, words that I've written, maybe. And they'll have these videos. And they can come back and they can look at these videos whenever they find themselves in their own temporal paradox of meaninglessness, in their own temporal paradox of chasing the past, chasing something that they can't catch, and thinking in a nonlinear way. They can come back to these videos, and hopefully the things that I say to them in these videos will remind them that you can create whatever you want. And you can create however you want it. And it can be derivative. And it can be simple. And it can be shallow. It can be deep. Whatever the case may be, it has value because you created it and you decided that it had value. Look in the box. Inside it, there's another box. Look in that box and find another one. And then another one. Until you get to the last one, the smallest one. Open that box. See the kitchen. See the clock. Get inside the time machine. Get your dad. And when you get there, he will say, hey. You can say, hey. Or you can say, hey, Dad. Or you can say, I missed you, you old man. And he is old. Notice how old he is. But don't make him feel bad about it. He's been waiting here for you for a long time in his kitchen, trapped. Listen to him explain how he never meant to leave. He did leave, though. What he means, and listen to him good, is that he left, and by the time he figured out he wanted to come home, it was too late. His time machine broke down, and he got trapped in the past. Tell him you understand. That's what happens to all of us, you should say. The path of a man's life is straight, 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 until the moment when it isn't anymore. And after that it begins to meander around aimlessly, and then get tangled. And then at some point, the path gets so confusing that the man's ability to move around in time, his device for conveyance, his memory of what he loves, the engine that moves him forward, it can break, and he can get permanently stuck in his own history. When he says this to you, just nod. You are angry. There's still a lot to explain. There's still many questions to be answered. There will be time for that. Just nod and be sympathetic, because you should be. You know all about tangled loops yourself now. You know you don't want to waste any more of the time that you have together, because he looks tired. He spent all these years stuck here, waiting inside an empty minute, a safe minute, when he knows he can be found, hoping you got the message. And you did. But he doesn't get those years back. And he's older than you remember. Invite him into your machine. Try not to chuckle as he looks small and impressed like a boy, marveling at how far things have come.